And I think we're live. Hello, Jennifer.
Hi, Mimi. Good to see you.
It's great to see you. And I guess we got to see each other in person not too long ago. So this is another delight.
It's the beauty of living in a town where you run into musicians at various things. That's one of the things I actually love about being around musicians. It's a small world. We all share a lot.
It is. It's very special. So as we're just waiting for folks to join us, welcome everybody. It's great to have you here on Tea with Mimi. Really quickly, Jennifer, because you're a fellow flutist, I just noticed, I never noticed this before. I don't have a flute tonight, but I noticed that I positioned my chair this way as if I was in a place. Do you still do that?
I don't for my back. But I think that's probably how I hurt my back, was riding with everything kind of off to the side that you mentioned it, because my keyboard is not a lot. My music keyboard, the MIDI keyboard I use to put notes in finale, is off to the side. So I'm always at an angle like I was playing the flute, which is probably not the best thing in reality.
Well, I guess we're a little lopsided and those habits die hard, but that's interesting. We've never talked about this before, our asymmetrical lives as flutists, but together.
Isn't it interesting, though, the things that you don't even think about? You train so much as an artist, and then the next thing you know, you're like, oh, you've developed this habit and your body has developed these grooves that they do when you get into making music. So it's pretty funny.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I am going to just officially welcome you, Jennifer, and one of the busiest people I know, and not just busy, but busy writing gorgeous music. Thank you for taking the time to be on Tea with Mimi.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's so much fun. Really, I always love talking to you, Mimi. So it's just the best. And I can see already you got some very cool people on here with Bryce and Ken Hutchins, really people that I adore. I met Bryce actually at the NFA convention in Chicago, in August, I think it was. So he came up to me at the orchestra concert and introduced himself. So we got some good people on here, I can tell.
That is wonderful. Hello, Bryce and Ken and Victor. Great to have you here. Welcome, everybody. Please say hello. You have the opportunity to put some comments and questions for Jennifer Higdon, and we'd love to hear from you. We'd also love to hear what you're drinking this evening on Tea with Mimi or another beverage. So we will get to that in a moment. Actually, Jennifer, what do you have with you tonight?
A bottle of water, because this is the safest thing when cats may show up on screen. When you're doing these things, my cats always show up at some point and invade the area. So I have to use a bottle that I can close. It's safer for everybody.
Oh, okay. Well, very healthy. And I hope we get to meet your cats. And I'm drinking some green mango peach tea tonight.
Ooh, nice.
Very, very much love tea. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to introduce you, although I think you really don't need an introduction, but we are thrilled to have on Tea with Mimi, Jennifer Higdon, composer, the winner of the Pulitzer Prize and 3 Grammy Awards, one of the most celebrated and often performed living American composers. Her music has been commissioned and performed by major orchestras, festivals, ensembles, and artists around the globe. Her work, Blue Cathedral, is today's most performed contemporary orchestral piece with 600 plus performances worldwide and counting. Wow. And I heard it when it was relatively new, and it is absolutely moving.
I'm thinking about that. You probably overlapped with the premiere of it at Curtis or something. Is that right? Am I remembering that correctly?
It could be. What year was it premiered?
Was it 2000? I believe it was. Yeah.
Yeah. I graduated in 99, but I remember kind of right in those times. Yeah. Well, Jennifer's first opera, Cold Mountain, won the International Opera Award for Best World Premiere. And among many other accolades, she's a member of the Academy of Arts and Letters, has received the Guggenheim Fellowship, and many other things. She holds degrees from Bowling Green University, the Curtis Institute of Music, and the University of Pennsylvania, and was on faculty of the Curtis Institute of Music for many years on the composition faculty, and before that teaching courses including 20th century music. So you were there when I got to Curtis when I was 12, Jennifer, so we really go way back. It's
wonderful. Oh my gosh, were you 12?
I was.
Oh my goodness. I often wonder what that's like for really young people. to be at a school like Curtis. That's a pretty amazing thing to think about. So that must have really made an impression. It made an impression on me. I was 22, so I was a decade older than you when I came to Curtis as a student. But that's impressive, Mimi. That is.
Thank you. Well, it was a really nurturing environment for me with Julius Baker, who brought me, and Jeffrey Kaner, and people like you. I mean, I remember when my mother called you, I think, for some advice on summer festivals or something, and then we played flute duets, and then early on, I started getting to know your music, and I actually founded an ensemble. My first ensemble was while I was still a Curtis student, called Composers from Curtis Chamber Ensemble. And my co-founders were my buddies, David Sirkin Ludwig and Daniel Kellogg, and you were our faculty advisor at the time.
That's right, I forgot about that. That's right.
Yeah, so it was great to do that. But, we have lots to talk about, of course, and a lot of music to share. So I think it'd be really nice to start with some music. And just we're getting more friends commenting, which is wonderful. Daniel is drinking black coffee. That is great to know. Let us know what you're enjoying on Tea with Mimi. And Ken's cats are around as well. So we have some maybe some dog people like me. And then Keith is here, and he has a really nice comment about listening to your
music. Hi, Keith. Yeah, I used to conduct up at the University of Pennsylvania. I did a year after I came out of grad school there, and but mostly I'm writing now. I realized that when you conduct, you have to really learn a score. So I really had a moment in my life where I had to decide which way I was going to go, and composing was the thing that kind of pulled me along. So, but I'm really grateful WRTI does broadcast a lot of my music. They're great.
Yes, it's great to have those classical stations. And hello, Adrian. And what we're going to start with, I thought, Jennifer, is the piece that you wrote for us, for my Dolce Suono Trio, Dolce Suono Ensemble Commission, American Canvas. And we were so fortunate that you wrote this for us, and we're inspired by three American artists that are close to your heart. When we were talking about, I think we were having a cheese plate at Park, actually.
Yes.
About what the projected work might be about, and just discovered how we share a love for art and art history, and especially from your background. So maybe you'd like to introduce the art component of American Canvas. I'm going to just share the cover of our album of it for Innova.
Yes, are you doing one of the particular movements, Mimi? Is that that's the cover. That's a great cover. I thought about this a lot, because I often think about, how does a composer capture the essence of a visual art and put it in a piece of music. And in this particular piece, I was thinking about the process of different composers, Georgia O'Keeffe being the painters. The painter who was born the farthest back in the 1800s, actually, but a real kind of, maybe when I think about it, actually, the first major woman artist in American history to have a lot of paintings that are in major collections. So she was one of the movements. Jackson Pollock, his splatter paint method. I thought I'd try to capture that, very contrasting to Georgia O'Keeffe, because sometimes I look, when I'm doing a multi-movement work, I will find the most contrasting things I can. And then finally, Andrew Wyeth, because I find the Wyeth family fascinating. In the museum down in Delaware here, that actually the Brandywine has an amazing collection. And I have always just adored the Wyeth family in general, but Andrew Wyeth, the light that emanates from his canvases. So when Mimi asked me to write something for flute and cello and piano, I thought, wow, this is a great combination of colors. Let me explore what I can do. Can I capture the essence of what these painters do in their process, but also kind of the energy as well?
Yeah, and I think you really did that with the three contrasting movements. I thought I would share a bit from the Pollock movement, and we can talk a little bit about it after, as I set up the share, and you're all going to be hearing our Dolce Suono Trio with me on flute, and this was Nathan Vickery on cello and Charles Abramovic on piano. I'm gonna set that up. And it's impossible to stop it because it's so much perpetual emotion and rhythmic energy and excitement, and that soaring melody popping through the pointillistic notes that you give us. So bravo.
Thank you. It's interesting. When I was thinking about writing each of these movements, I looked at film of how each painter approached a canvas, like what they actually did when they had a brush in hand. And Pollock was the one that actually he was slinging things. It was always very active, a lot of movement. Whereas Andrew Wyeth would make the smallest little marks with his brush because the method he used was completely different. The type of temper was so different, that process. And then you look at George O'Keeffe, she was much more meticulous, but there wasn't as much chaos. Whereas Pollock was very much like just sling the paint, make some sort of abstract thing that covered a lot of territory. So when the gestures are kind of folding in on themselves, and it's a very active movement, but it's fun to listen to the play. I imagine it's pretty hard. I'm glad I'm not playing it, Mimi.
Well, thanks. No, we love a challenge. I have to say that. And I hope our friends watching, if they haven't heard the album, do find the recording to hear all three movements. But yeah, I wonder, what did you think? Because you've written for so many chamber ensembles and of course for flute in different contexts. For flute, cello, piano, what does it offer you as a composer? You mentioned colors, so I'm just curious about.
Yeah, because the cello sings like a string instrument, and it's because it has such a wide range, it's very good at being able to do things fast, articulated, which not all instruments, like if I did this with bassoon, it would be tricky. It would not have the same reaction. The soaring melody that a cello can achieve, because it can play in the range, not the upper range of the flute, but it can overlap in the range, but it can also go really, really low and give you kind of a percussive sound. I love the double stop possibility on string instruments. But I find that the warmth of the flute and the cello, they're a different kind of warmth. The two are. So there's something about their lyrical qualities it's so gorgeous. They blend really well, but you can also make them sound like really separate voices. You can't do that with all instruments. Some instruments, they just stand out and they don't have quite the ability to blend in the same way, but both cello and flute do. And the piano just is kind of like a giant orchestra unto itself. So it was fun writing for you. And you're right. I've written a lot of chamber music. Our talk made me go back and look at how many pieces I've written that have flute majorly involved. And there were 28 pieces. I couldn't believe it. I was like, good grief. I'd never looked at that, Mimi. So thank you for inspiring me to sit down and go, okay, what have I written when it's got flute in it? But yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Wow. Well, thank you for this wonderful music. And I know the flutists on the show with us will appreciate that. And I want to say hi to Vitali, my Curtis classmate. You probably know as well. Great to see you. And lovely comments. Sophia, thanks for being here. Jonathan, thanks for your bravi. And Adrian, thanks for that lovely comment. Yeah, we love to hear from you. Please put your comments and questions for Jennifer Higdon as we listen to some music and keep chatting about it. We got into some flute stuff. So I have another flute performance. This is with duo pianist, Charles Abramovic. We've been together 20 years, and he's also a founding artist of Dolce Sono Ensemble. So y'all just heard him on the trio. This is your Autumn Reflection. So a much earlier work. I think it was the first Higdon piece that I played back when I was a Curtis student and just meeting you. And I find it so beautiful and lyrical. And I want to ask you about your connection to autumn, maybe before I put it on and give people something to listen for specifically, since we have the benefit of your being here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had thought, and I'm trying to remember, maybe I was writing it during autumn, but I've always found it fascinating how the color of leaves overlap. I grew up, part of my growing up was on a farm with 40 acres where you could just walk in the woods. And it was always, I went out for a walk every day. I'm an avid walker, and I just love looking at the leaves and thinking about what that's like. And I had originally written this for Carol Winston. It's not like I was just coming out of grad school. I mean, I really was just coming out of grad school, and I got this commission, and I thought it would be the only commission I probably would ever get. I literally thought that. And the piece is like from 1990 something, I think 6 or 7. I mean, it's pretty far back, but I thought a lot about Carol's her high. I guess the color of her playing is really gorgeous, but I also thought about the complexity of leaves, the way they overlap. And so that's the lines, the way the piano and the flute, which is tricky because when I've had to play it, I was like, oh, daggum, this is actually pretty hard. But at some point towards the end, you hear like a little clock gonging, and that's like time moving on. I find it fascinating to kind of, composers are always just messing with time. We try to mess with time so that you don't know how much time is going by when you're listening to something, but you also sometimes are just marking time with your piece. So there's a little clocking sound as if autumn's moving into winter at the end of this.
Well, that's a wonderful intro. I think just like American Chemists, there's a lot of visual element in this, even though it's more about nature perhaps than about art. So we're going to start it. This is actually on my YouTube. I'm not going to share it from YouTube. I'm sharing a video file because there could be ads coming on YouTube. So we shouldn't get an ad. This is the opening of Jennifer Higdon's Autumn Reflection for flute and piano.
Nice playing, Mimi.
Thank you so much. I'm just there.
Yeah.
And it was so hard to find a place to stop because this big buildup was just starting.
I know that. I think my music has this. Because I have to sometimes pull excerpts from my opera, and then I'm like, but the music's written so it goes right on to the next thing. So it's tricky. But listening to it, I had forgotten that I had made the decision to put a kind of a melancholy feel in the autumn music, as well as the thinking about colors. I think Ken had asked about the aspects of colors and season. And I mean, for me, I always think of autumn as being that explosive orange and yellow that you see with the leaves. It doesn't always happen, but that's kind of my association. The cool, crisp air, what it smells like, and the snap of the rhythm is a little bit like that. But that's definitely a challenging piece. Listening to it, I'm like, dadgummit, that's pretty hard. So
Yeah. Well, I love the long lines. It feels great as a flutist. It's very vocal. It's what kind of where we live a little bit. As
yeah, true.
But it's great. And actually, I think that was from the Dolce Suono Ensemble Women Pioneers of American Music program, where we also premiered American Canvas. And I think it was in tandem with the premiere of Cold Mountain by Opera Philadelphia. We had done sort of a announcement. So very exciting times for us with your music. And actually, thinking of Autumn Reflection, we both Dolce Suono Ensemble and then at Curtis, I had played your autumn music for wind quintet. You wrote it, I think, as a reflection on Samuel Barber's iconic summer music for wind quintet, one of the greatest. I'm not just going to say wind quintet's chamber works, okay, out there.
Yeah, totally. I know. That was it was a little scary. It was kind of a personal challenge, because I played in wind quintet in my undergrad, and I was so familiar with the summer music. And I remember sitting at Norfolk Chamber Music Festival on the front porch there early one morning with Sam Barron, flutist Sam Barron, and he and I were talking about that piece because he was telling me that he actually played that for Barber, that they tried out a bunch of stuff and Barber took notes, and then they may have actually even played the premiere, but it was the kind of thing. And he said that Barber was always depressed by the ending of his piece. He came back to Sam later on and said, why didn't you tell me the ending didn't work? But I think his ending works just fine. But composers often think of their pieces one way and the world thinks of it another way. But it was kind of an interesting thing, again, for autumn music to think about autumn, to try to find something that would pair with the Barber. That was kind of the thing. It was scary to write a wind quintet for me, because I'd played in quintet. Somehow that makes it harder when I've actually played the music. I know that sounds really strange, but maybe I know too much about it or something. I don't know. But I did something unusual in autumn music. I used sounds that get darker as the quintet goes on. So the oboe switches the English horn and the clarinet switches the bass clarinet. So that the hue kind of starts going down, the pitch goes down, and the colors get a little darker. So kind of a strange thing to do, but sometimes composers do strange things.
No, it's a great thing for the timbres in the piece, and everything you're saying is making me want to ask you different questions. But one thing that definitely is connection with your music, and then the autumn music reflecting on Barber's summer music. I guess you're just a generation or two away in terms of your teacher at Curtis being Ned Warham.
Yeah.
Coming out of this Barber tradition, how has that influenced you among other influences?
It has really. I mean, I think I first got to know Barber's music was the violin concerto. I was playing at Bowling Green. I was playing in the orchestra, and we were recording the violin concerto, and I'd never heard anything like that. That's a really hard piece when you play in the orchestra, especially the last movement, which the notes, the 16th, chase each other. So for me to sit inside an orchestra as an undergrad was an amazing experience. I remember doing Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe and Kodai and all these incredible works where the color swirls around you in the orchestra. And there's nothing like sitting inside an orchestra. It's a hard thing for people to understand when you sit out an audience, that when you're inside the orchestra, it's like a tornado of sound. But it's a warm bath tornado. It's not a bad tornado. It's incredible. And I think that really influenced me being a flute player, sitting in the middle of the orchestra and playing these great works and going, holy cow, how did anybody put those together? Think to put all the notes on the page. It's fascinating to think about. And even now, I think a lot of my orchestration, my searching for colors in the writing come about from having sat in an orchestra and experiencing Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe with all those great runs in the flute and piccolo and alto flute, and it's just kind of incredible. There's just no, I mean, it's just heaven. So I'm constantly trying to replicate the sound of what it was like to be a flute player within an orchestra.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. You're not the only composer of today who I admire who has cited Ravel in terms of an influence for orchestration, among other things, with the richness of timbre, and Debussy as well in a different way. But as you're speaking, so that's fascinating. Playing in orchestra as a flutist obviously was very formative for you. What about other influences growing up? I know you've spoken about various popular music that you grew up with that has fed into what your music is today. Yeah, I'd love to know about that.
Yeah, it's really, I have such an unusual background because I didn't start out around classical music. My dad was an artist working at home. He had music playing all the time, but it was 60s folk and rock. I remember we also had a couple of recordings of Debussy. It was Tomita, I think it was. It was an electronic version of Debussy, and that was probably my first experience with Debussy. But I was in so much rock and roll and the Beatles that for me, when I started out studying, I basically auditioned. I think I knew 3 flute pieces, like a Bach sonata, which means I didn't really know it well, a movement from Mozart, and Cecile Chaminade's concertino.
Wow.
And so I'm kind of amazed I got into major in music. I'm sure my teachers are like, oh my gosh, she knows absolutely zero, which is true. I didn't know anything. But the thing was, I just thought it was magic. To me, it seemed like magic. And I know a real influence for me was probably the John Williams scores for Star Wars, because they came out, I think my freshman year of high school, the first movie came out, which is actually movie number 4, I think it is in the series. But I remember my parents buying me the album with that soundtrack and the sound of the orchestra blasting out of my little record player. Remember record players?
Absolutely. They're kind of back, right?
Yeah, exactly. Man, it was just that. And, I recently got to tell John Williams just how much he had influenced me, the vivid colors that he achieved in his movie scores. It's like the perfect age, your teenage years. That's the stuff that's really influencing you. And I remember once stumbling across The Rite of Spring, an 8-track tape that I bought. I think it was on sale at the library, and I listened to that thing over there. I'm like, what the heck is this? But all that music was very foreign to me. Mm-hmm. So, but I was also influenced by like bluegrass, because being in the Smoky Mountains, you hear a lot of bluegrass in that area. You hear a lot of Dolly Parton. She grew up in I guess it was the next mountain over, you would technically. It was the next county over a couple of mountain ridges. So when I think about what my childhood sound world is, because that's a big thing for a composer, there are a lot of influences, and I'm still absorbing. I just got the new Bonnie Raitt CD. I'm absorbing all the time, everything that comes out. Hamilton, listening to the musical there, listening to how he handles the rhythm, what do they do? And I think about how this feeds into what I write for instruments, what helps kind of cross the line at various points. Like if you want to mix the Concerto 4/3, I wrote for the Time for 3 guys, who I think were at Curtis right after you. Writing something that had a bluegrass classical slant was, for me, an interesting challenge. I did it in Cold Mountain too.
Yes.
But you have to really kind of stop and think when you're writing. You're like, oh, this is kind of a different theory. You're emphasizing different things. So it's like writing American Canvas, your piece there, thinking, all right, what did O'Keeffe do? What did Jackson Pollock do? How did these people handle their art forms differently? And how can I mimic that on a page? And then when I write these pieces, sometimes I'm tasked with doing something very specifically that someone has asked me to do. Like one of the things you have on my mandolin concerto, there was a special request from the mandolin player. This was a really unusual request. I didn't realize, because I didn't know a ton of mandolin music. The pieces they have always just have string orchestra accompanying them. They don't ever have full orchestra, which I don't think I realized until I started investigating the instrumentation. But then I also realized that's the quietest instrument on the planet. And you have to figure out how to balance that kind of thing. And so he was adamant he wanted full orchestra. And I thought, oh boy, how am I going to balance a little mandolin player and a full orchestra? This sounds like a nightmare. But every piece that I write has some sort of challenge in it that I guess I never do it the same way twice, because, thinking about the paintings for your piece and thinking about Avi's mandolin concerto, what do I do to make that work, for the instrument, for other mandolin players, but to balance an entire orchestra behind it. I mean, you play concertos, Joe Tien's concerto. It's something to think about, it's kind of an interesting challenge.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to hear some of your concertos, but yeah, and you just mentioned the Joe Tian Flute Concerto, which I'm performing and touring with right now. And so you must be so proud of your former student, Ed Curtis, my great buddy, Joe Tian. He's written a phenomenal flute concerto, which we gave the world premiere of with the Marine Chamber Orchestra of the President's Own U.S. Marine Band and Colonel Jason Fettig, who I know is a frequent collaborator of yours as well. So it was a thrilling premiere. And since then have done performances in Texas and Maryland, and in a couple weekends, Allentown Symphony. So for those of you who are in the Pennsylvania area, I hope to see you there. But yeah, great addition to the flute repertoire. And we're going to hear some of your mandolin concerto next. It's a perfect segue. First, hello to friends who are tuning in, Peggy and Ricky. Hi, Etienne. Some wonderful comments and recollections. Ken, Krista, and Daniel has asked about whether you're going to write a flute concerto. So you can prepare.
I should answer that question. I've actually written one. It premiered. It's not a big flute concerto, but I wrote a 15-minute concerto that premiered at the National Flute Convention. Bryce, who's on here, was there. I think that's where he and I met. We were met down at the front, but I have the piece is called The Light That We Can Hear. I have to look it up. I cannot remember. So I wrote it down. But it's going to have Valerie Coleman was the flute player at the premiere. It was Leonard Slacken. I can't believe the National Flute Association got Leonard Slacken to conduct the Chicago Philharmonic for that concert. Was kind of an amazing thing. But it has its New York premiere, actually. Valerie Coleman's doing it with the Manus Orchestra with David Hayes, who you've probably worked with.
Yes.
Yeah, he's going to be conducting. We're actually like Alice Tully Hall, on March 8th. So if any of you are in the New York area and want to come up to Alice Tully Hall, the flute concerto will be done there. I wrote a concerto. This was an interesting challenge. I knew we would have almost no rehearsal. So the idea was to write a piece that could assemble easily. That it sounds weird, but like my violin concerto is so hard to assemble, a lot in the orchestra, but sometimes you think about these things, and you want to make them work for everybody.
Oh, it's such a big deal. I think all of us who are flutists will want to hear it and play it soon. But yeah, this whole idea of composing, rehearsal time, the practicality is extremely important. In fact, before we went live, you and I were talking about the history of American music a bit and how some of the classic symphonists from the earlier part of the 20th century had a lot more orchestral performances and rehearsals in the post-World War II period than today. So a lot of composers today get to have more performances of chamber works, just as things have changed and developed. Over time.
And too, that's a good point, because band has become a bigger entity, and looking at the President's Own U.S. Marine Band, they've got their orchestra and chamber orchestra component. It's all the same unit. It's all the same. I think it's 240 musicians or something they draw out of. But you realize, musicians are also just more skilled in going back and forth in the repertoire, which is, for me as a composer, is just an absolute delight.
Yeah. Well, they're such a great group. That's for sure.
Oh my God, yeah.
So let's hear some of your mandolin concerto. And I'm just going to get it set, and then we can talk a little bit more about it. Hello, everybody. Welcome. And as I share that, just for our viewers, if you came in late, the whole show will be on as a video after, or you could share it with friends as well. So here is Jennifer Higdon's Mandolin Concerto excerpt.
a few notes.
That's fantastic, Jennifer. Definitely leaving us wanting more of that concerto. And I was just struck by how you it was in many ways in terms of the rhythm and the colors, and just but fascinating pairing mandolin with orchestra in this way, with really prominent harp and percussion at times.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing trying to figure out how to balance those instruments. And I realized that the harp and the vibraphone they can play along with the mandolin and kind of support the sound. Weirdly, it doubles. It's like doubling, but it is tricky. I had to keep the orchestra out of the way a lot. And that movement in particular, I made sure, because I had a debate. Mandolin is used a lot in country and bluegrass. And so when I was starting this piece, I thought, do I actually make the effort to try to do a bluegrass piece? But then I thought, all right, it's Avi Avital. He's from Israel. He lives in Berlin. Probably not a good fit. So that last movement has elements of bluegrass with offbeats, but it also has a Middle Eastern sort of feel to it. So the scales it uses, so I wanted to pay tribute to Avi's artistry. I was so relieved the piece worked, though. This was one of the scariest. And it was written during the pandemic, during the lockdown. I couldn't work with Avi. The only thing I could do was he would send me scores that he had, works he'd commissioned. He commissions a lot. And I would try things out and write it down. And I would send him an email, a picture of the music. And he would, because he was at home, he would sit there with a mandolin and his phone down in his hands, and he would play and try things. And then he would send that back to me, and I would sit there and go, okay, this chord works, this chord doesn't work. So the whole back and forth was completely online. And I'm like, wow, we've really reached it's a whole different reality.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, so much music, we made that way. But I should say, so the mandolin concerto performance that we all just saw was with Avi Avital on mandolin, Munich Philharmonic, and Christoph Urbanski conductor. I'm so glad you shared that, Jennifer. And it's so interesting how through commissioning new works like yours, Avital has really kind of revolutionized mandolin in the concert hall.
I know that's actually true. I mean, there are instruments sometimes I write for. When I did a tuba concerto, I was like, oh, there's not a ton of repertoire. There's not a ton for mandolin. They almost always play transcriptions. That's the thing of Vivaldi works and stuff like that. So finding something that actually would balance an orchestra was definitely hard. And it gave me a lot of anxiety, but you just have to try things and then see if they'll work. And weirdly, this is the first major premiere I had that I was not able to attend at the time. It was in Munich, but my mom had just fallen ill, and so I could not go over. But the orchestra, Munich Phil, was really good about videotaping everything and audio taping and sending me things immediately so I could listen, make changes, and send PDFs back of the changes. So it's the things we do to make our art.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad it had happy ending as a performance for sure. And actually, we're going to hear another concertante work by you. And interestingly, your 3 Grammys have all been for concertos. Mm-hmm. And this is something I think about a lot as a soloist performing concertos. The interaction, the dialogue, sometimes the antagonism perhaps even between soloist and orchestra, not so much in terms of the balance, the practicality of it, but as someone who does this incredibly well, how do you personify the soloist versus orchestra or with orchestra in your work?
Well, the biggest thing is always to make sure, this is going to sound really simplistic, that you can hear the soloist. But I can remember attending concerts of concerti where you couldn't hear the soloist, or you had to strain to hear it. And I'm like, it should not be a battle. And what you do is you try to get to know what the instrument does well and what fits that performer well, and how basically you can make them sound good while also exploring the whole instrument. Because you may be introducing someone in the audience who's never experienced a concerto, or a concerto of a flute, or a concerto of a mandolin. You're introducing that instrument also to the audience. So you want it to sound good. But with a concerto, you can also kind of let your imagination run wild and just write like crazy. Do you know what I mean? You can actually, and I have a tendency to write a million notes. So this actually goes well with the concerto form. So, but really, you have to get to know the rep. It sounds weird, but it's just the library is like your best friend when you're a composer. And it also helps having YouTube, because some of this stuff, the 2 examples I gave were both written in lockdown. So it's not like I couldn't go to the library. There was nothing I could do. So you have to kind of figure out different ways to approach these problems.
Well, obviously, being heard, having good balance is crucial. And it's interesting, too, because, I mean, from the time of Mozart through, classic and romantic and a lot of 20th century concertos, it was all about hearing the soloist or the soloist line being very independent from the orchestra. But then I think some contemporary concerto styles are more about blending them together.
Yeah, I think that's actually true. And you know what? One thing may suit one person and not the other. One of the things I always think about though is I don't want the soloist to have to push their sound.
Yeah.
So I remember talking to Hilary Hunt about this a lot. You know what? She told me the list of concertos that were really a struggle for her to play against, which it was very educational for me. I'm like, all right, so why is this the case? So by looking at violin concertos and figuring out where she struggled, she has a pretty clear sound. I'm like, all right, this affects all instrumentalists. Anyone gets up in front of a group has to be heard. And I don't want you to have to push your sound. You know, you want control, but I want you to also be able to play quietly and lyrically. You shouldn't have to be constantly like a machine gun going off. So it's interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, even for violin, because, you know, as a flutist, you're probably very attuned to that because we have our own balance situations.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. I think sometimes people think that we're an incredibly loud instrument. That's only at the very top. So
yeah, I know it's true. I mean, that's you would never write a flute concerto down low. Anytime I go low in like the piece I wrote, that's like a flute concerto, everybody's out of the way. It's like pizzicato. It's something very thin in the orchestra so we can at least let the audience hear the low flute. That's the thing. So
well, yeah, the transparency helps so much in those textures. And obviously they came out with the mandolin. Before we listen to your dual for two percussion, is it two percussionists? Is that how you would describe it?
Yeah, two percussionists, two dueling percussionists, two friends who like to try to outdo each other.
Love it. Well, you know, some of what we're talking about is already kind of getting to an answer to a question I received in advance, which is, what would be your advice for young composers?
Write as much music as possible, look at scores, and work with as many performers as possible. And listen to the performers, because performers will tell you if something's not working, you know. And sometimes composers are like, well, the orchestration book says you can do that. But the fact of the matter is, the performer is your best advocate and also your best educator. They can tell you what works, what doesn't, what's practical, what's uncomfortable on the instrument. I mean, sometimes I find people forget to let the flute player breathe. So, you know, if the composer was a pianist, they often don't think about the breathing aspect. They don't think about the fact that string players also think about breathing, although they can play constantly. But it's an interesting challenge. And I make mistakes. I make miscalculations all the time. I have to go back and I have to adjust things. I mean, the Mandolin Concerto just went through its 4th orchestra performances last week, and I finally finished tweaking it. After all this time, it premiered like 2 years ago, and I'm still like, okay, this trumpet line is not quite right. So it's a constant situation of tweaking. But and Ken was wondering about when is the recording coming out. Ken, we're working on it. The Atlanta Symphony said they wanted to record it, and Avi just sent me a message. He's a Deutsche Grammophon artist. I think he's got an orchestra lined up in Europe. So a lot of people are asking about that Mandolin Concerto. It's been a pretty popular thing. We're trying to figure it out. I told Philly Orchestra they need to program it. So it's really, people don't get to hear a mandolin. I mean, you know, it's a really unusual instrument, but if they have any association with country or bluegrass, it is actually an integral part of that world. So sometimes you can get people to come to the concert hall who normally they might come for something else that's not classical. So it's kind of an interesting way to bring more people into the hall.
That's fascinating. Yes. Well, congratulations. We all look forward to the recording when it does come out. And thank you, Anna, for your lovely comment, and Ken, interesting recollections. And we're going to go to the next Higdon work, which is dual for two percussionists and orchestra. And while I set it up, we have Svet Stoyanov and Matthew Strauss percussion with the University of Miami Frost School Orchestra and Gerard Schwartz conducting. So here's an excerpt from that.
That's a piece with a lot of energy. Yeah, I got to tell you, this is so funny. I was just starting that piece when the lockdown happened. And with percussion, you can do lots of non-pitched instruments, or you can do all pitched. And I chose to do all pitched, but I could tell listening to that piece that we were still in the panic mode of what's going to happen. And that piece has like so much nervous energy. The guys are really incredible players, so I wanted to really kind of push them. They only play one marimba, one vibraphone, and then those 6 timpani. Wow. But I can tell when I hear the piece, I'm like, oh yeah, this was the first couple of months of the lockdown. So, and I had to keep writing. You know, people were constantly saying to me, all right, so Shakespeare did all these great plays, you know, during the plague. What are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to try to get back on track. I was a little behind on my schedule of delivering pieces. And I realized that we didn't know when this was going to end. And for all I knew, the Houston Symphony, who was the lead commissioner, would program it in the fall. So I knew, because my music is so hard, I would have to get the music to those guys as quickly as I could. I thought, well, they're locked down, they could work on it. So that's what I did. I just kind of blew through writing, and it turned out to be extremely therapeutic because it was one aspect of my life that just stayed consistent. Basically, it meant that I didn't have as many distractions. I knew I could sit down and write every day. And that's the same thing I was doing before the pandemic. And I knew I'd be doing it after the pandemic. And it was a consistency that kind of helped me keep my emotional and mental balance. But the mandolin concerto, which came at the end of the lockdown, actually is much calmer. And you can tell by then my nervous system had adjusted. So it's probably a really good study for someone who just likes to study the nervous system of composers. I don't know.
That is amazing. I mean, that is your very energetic music, but yeah, on extra caffeine, maybe.
Yeah, it's just like, oi.
Well, I love the physicality of percussionists, because there they are doing it, and it's so visual. Yeah. And I remember seeing your percussion concerto for one percussionist, right, in concert, and the person really has to run around to all the different instruments you put. That must be super fun to just write for percussion.
It is. And it really, you know, when you got really good players again. And the thing I realized, Houston was the lead off orchestra. And then we were going to the Frost School. And I thought, oh, I've got to make something that will work for both a professional orchestra, but also a college level orchestra. And that was an interesting thing also to think about. I mean, a lot of times I'm only writing for a professional orchestra, but when you're thinking, all right, there's a college group in here and you don't really know what you're walking into. That orchestra turned out to be really excellent at the Frost School. Some of the kids, God, the one percussionist who plays in the piece was like a freshman. He looked so young. I'm like, are you all right?
It's a great experience. It's amazing. But you know, it's interesting because like the professional orchestras have so little rehearsal time, and sometimes orchestras have more. So there's kind of
that's a trade-off. It's true. Yeah. But that means we actually recorded the premiere, believe it or not, and that's actually coming out on Naxos in probably the spring. I couldn't believe it. Was pretty unnerving though, because you write something and you know you're going to be recording the actual live performance of the premiere. You're like, well, I haven't quite gotten it adjusted yet. So it meant every day after rehearsal, I'd have to go back to the hotel and make like 40 adjustments. And I'd have to redo the music parts and send those as PDFs to the librarian who stayed late, who would print them up and get them onto the stand. So the next day when we had rehearsal, they had the right things. And that's the way it's like working a mixing board where you're pulling down dynamics or adjusting something. And it's kind of a fascinating process, but it's definitely one that compromises the composer's sleep. So you go a week without sleeping too much. So
yeah, this is a fascinating insight into the life of the composer, or you as the composer. And it's so funny because with my history background, I'm thinking about how Handel wrote music so fast that he would ask his librettist to write text faster, and all the pages were flying around as they did this. And this is, I guess, like the modern and technology version of you making adjustments on the spot and even mixing a little bit in the audience.
It is interesting, isn't it? I mean, there's probably a tremendous amount of overlay. As I tell audiences, it's still the same process. We still write this one note at a time. Mm-hmm. That part hasn't changed at all. We still have to put the dynamics in, the articulations. You still have to dream up the big gestures and hope that the whole thing adheres together. So I find it also just a really fascinating process because I'm constantly looking at other creative individuals. And having been a flute player who went through the process of learning concertos myself and also trying to learn difficult pieces, I think that plays into the way I write. I'm constantly saying, all right, what am I putting the musicians through? What will they have to practice? And I want to always make sure that there is interesting material for the orchestra. You know, that's that's an imperative thing. So I tend to write a lot of interesting solo lines within the orchestra to interact with the soloist. Now, it means that they have to practice. There's no offbeats for anybody. Everybody, even the tuba player, is really going to town. But the players are so good. I'm like, yeah, let's give everyone interesting material. It puts more on me because I have to shape every gesture that comes along. But I have found that the players also kind of embrace it because they feel like they're being heard on a stage.
Yes. Well, I know we appreciate it so much that every line is just written with love and care and interesting and a challenge. And just back to this story you told about making the premiere, the recording as a part of a pandemic thing. I mean, I think as performers too, so much of what happened is we would perform and put that out there. My Dolce Suono Ensemble is still performing live for people, but also filming our concerts for release 3 weeks later. And it's a very different experience from a recording session in, I would not even a studio, because a lot of us record in concert halls, but still where you do many more takes of things in smaller sections. And there's something very exciting, sometimes nerve-wracking about knowing it's going to be one take, maybe a patch, and then it goes out. But in a way, I think we reconnect with the feeling of performance. And maybe, I guess, there's a story of Archer Rubinstein, who used to record everything 3 times and pick the best one. And so,
whoa, really? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
When you think about it, this is what Beethoven and Mozart did. They didn't get the record. So the only chance the piece had going out into the world was that first performance, which now I think about it, Beethoven was always doing everything at the last minute. Like the ink was literally still wet on the parts. And I'm guessing the reality is because of the level of playing of the instruments in those days, and because they were playing a lot and there wasn't a lot of rehearsal, probably those premieres didn't sound that great. Yeah. In reality, I mean, we never think to ask that question. What did it sound like for Beethoven and Mozart and Brahms? If they were playing the piano and they were playing their own piece, that's one thing. But if you're doing the Ode to Joy, I mean, that's a lot of forces to put together. And let's face it, the performers were not as good as what we have today. The performers today are phenomenal. I mean, any of them could get up and solo in front of an orchestra. So I'm, as a composer, I'm so much more lucky because I work with artists at a much higher level. Yeah. And even though we're recording, I try to keep in mind that those guys got one shot. They only heard these pieces usually only once, and then they went on and wrote the next piece. So our world is so different today, but in truth, it's actually much better for composers.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that because, yeah, it is fascinating to think back and maybe I love, wondering what you think about what performance or what premiere or even incident you'd want to be at, a fly on the wall for like the riot at Stravinsky's Rite of Spring or something, right? But then you think about like Bach cantatas, we get to play them on nice temperate stages, but when they were first done, people would often be waiting in the loft at church for hours in any weather without heat or of course without air conditioning and then play. And, we worry about playing in tune, but it must've been that much harder.
Oh yeah. And you think about what was the flute they were playing on? Was it even the flute like we have now? It may have been not at all. And you think about the gut strings that the string players had. And the tuning, I'm sure the pianos we know were not as developed. I mean, Beethoven was he was instrumental, pardon the pun, in getting the modern pianoforte into something where you could really put some serious pressure on the instrument without breaking all the strings. But the instruments were not as good then either. And, I'm sure they weren't as in tune. The players were probably not quite as skilled. When the Tchaikovsky violin concerto first came out, people thought it wasn't playable. Now everyone, they apply to Curtis or any conservatory and these kids can play it. So it's it's incredible, the development of the whole, I don't know, is it the progress of music, Mimi? Is that what it is? I guess it kind of is. We all participate in that.
Yeah, I guess so, Jennifer. And it was interesting because Julius Baker would always talk about how when he was in school and after, some of the repertoire that we consider everyday repertoire, like Ibert and Nielsen concertos, were considered almost unplayable, and that the technical level has increased so much. And this came up a little in my chat with Jeff Kainer last week, also on Tea with Mimi, because we were listening to some really old recordings, not just Baker, but we heard a Philippe Gobert flute recording from 1919. And of course, his playing was gorgeous and so expressive. And I'm like, yeah, we have probably better flutes and louder flutes and maybe more technical prowess at, I guess, younger ages today in terms of those repertoire pieces we deem normal. But the expressivity, I don't think, has improved, from some of these classics.
Yeah, but it is really interesting. I once heard a recording of Sam Barber's violin concerto in its premiere.
Yeah.
It was surprising. Barber had made a couple of mistakes in terms of orchestration. I mean, you could tell they're not what's in the orchestration now. They were not good choices, and he went back and adjusted. But you could also tell now that the violin players are much better, because honestly, it didn't sound great. I was surprised. I was like, oh, it's actually, it's a battle for everyone. And I can only fathom what it must have been like for even 100, 200 years ago. The music that I write is hard. It's really, even the stuff I've done for junior high, challenge those kids. It wouldn't be hard for you, but for them, they're like, oh, eighth notes. This is really, this is really difficult. But it is, I find it part of my job is to try to help advance kind of our sonic world and the way we think about rhythm. And it's kind of the same thing you do, Mimi, by having this group, by commissioning works, by recording, by advocating, by talking about it. There's something about that moves music history along. And it's something I realized when I was teaching the 20th century music class at Curtis, because I'd always talk about the history of the commissions and the pieces. And you think everything that's been written was a result of a commission or someone who stepped up, whether it was the church during Bach's time, or Beethoven had made arrangements for something with two different publishers. He wasn't telling both of them that he actually was doing this. But every single one of us contribute to the forward steps in the history of music. And for me, it's exciting to be a part of that flow. Percussion concertos were only something that came in at the end of the 20th century, maybe mid 20th century, not really, but the instruments are changing, the orchestra is changing, bands are changing. I mean, everybody's changing. But now that we have access via this, like doing an interview online, what a resource that is. I mean, me sending Avi Avatel stuff while he's at home in Berlin so he could check it out on his mandolin, and he videotapes it and sends it back to me. Good grief, what a world we live in.
No, it's not like Bach walking to the Buxtehude concert for days and days. But no, I know. But Jennifer, I thank you for what you said, and I just feel it's really great composers who drive this symbiotic relationship with performers and take us to the next level. And it's so thrilling to be a part of it.
Well, it's a joy to work with excellent musicians, Mimi. So you're a part of that too. And I couldn't do my job if the musicians weren't there doing it. It's not very interesting looking at dots on a page without the players there. It doesn't work so well. So
absolutely. And we're getting so many lovely comments. I want to thank Marty and Ronnie. Thanks, Mom. And Dominic and Rick and Ken. This is really, I'm so happy the discussion is sparking thoughts and comments, and we welcome your questions. And actually, while we're talking about composers and performers, I just want to share, I have a vintage photo right here of something we talked about, the composers from Curtis Chamber Ensemble that I founded with my friends. Oh, it might be coming through a little small, but this is you, our faculty advisor, with David Sirkin Ludwig and Daniel Kellogg, my Curtis classmates and great composers up on top. And then with more of the performers of the ensemble. Wow,
is that Anthony McGill? Is that looks like, and oh my gosh, is that Nathan Cole, I think? And
a pretty great group. So Anthony McGill, Nathan Cole, Margot Tackenhorst Ricos, Jeremy Kurtz.
Jeremy Kurtz, right. Oh my gosh, that's some photo. Maybe that's amazing.
I know. I
really
think David always talks
incredible.
about his hair or something, his hair story. But yeah, I love to share it every few years just to have that conversation with him. And I mean, these are lifelong, friends and colleagues. But it was exciting because at the time we were playing music by composers from Curtis's whole history. So Barber and Rockberg and Rorem, and that was the first time I played your autumn music we mentioned, and then by the student composers themselves. So it was just, it probably had me catch the bug for founding and running an ensemble, because it was a few years later that I founded Dolce Suono Ensemble. But it was very much about this composer performer friendship and the exciting music that comes out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Curtis has quite the history of composers. I'm sometimes just kind of amazed when someone was telling me Julius Eastman went to Curtis, and I'm like, wow.
Oh.
Yeah, Nina Rota wrote the music for, what was it, The Godfather, I think, or something?
Yes.
Or yeah,
Fellini
I mean,
films.
it's really a Rockberg. I look back on the history of Curtis, and the composition department has, man, it's like quite extraordinary. But composers, again, can't do it without the performers. We are dependent on you. So I always eternal gratitude for what you give to us. So thank you, Mimi.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. It's so mutual, and it's such an honor to hear you say that. But really, it's just a lifelong joy to be with you, discovering your new music and getting to play some of it, and share it with our listeners. And I kind of warned you that I had a musical surprise, so now I'm going to tell you what it is. We're going to listen to an excerpt of George Pearl's Sonata a Quattro. For flute, clarinet, violin, and cello. And it's from a Dolce Suono Ensemble performance we gave as part of the project you and I were just talking about when we were talking about some American music history. It's a Rediscoveries Festival of American Chamber Music, and focusing on lesser known chamber music by excellent American composers, kind of in the post-World War II period. So a lot of them born 1890s to 1920s. A lot of different styles. I mean, Walter Piston, Roger Sessions, Ralph Shapey, Irving Fine, and many others. So this is George Pearl, a non-Curtis composer, and very different style of music. Maybe I'll just put it on and get your reaction a little bit. And anyone else who's listening is welcome to comment as well. So while I set up the share, the performers are, I'm playing flute, and we have Yao Guangjai, clarinet, Miranda Cookson, violin, and Gabriel Cabezas, cello. So fantastic colleagues for this. Uh-oh. Is it playing? Oops, I don't think it's playing. 1 second. That's crazy.
George Pearl doesn't want to be heard. Is that the?
Well, it's not a John Cage moment of a silent piece. It really should play. If it doesn't, I'm going to try popping it into a new tab. Let me try that. If not, I'll just have it in the background. It's actually a video, so I hope we see it as well. But yeah, you know what? Give me one moment on that. I'm just going to hook it up one more time. Sorry about that. And hopefully this will work. I was actually, the reason I chose it, and I guess I'll just give it away, right? Before hearing it, is while I'm doing this connection. George Pearl was influenced so much by the Second Viennese School. So a very different tradition from the whole, let's say, Samuel Barber, the more neo-romantic American tradition, and of course others, because there was just such a plethora of styles in this period. So while that's hooking up, do you have composers that you really admire from this time period, Jennifer? Let's say.
Well, that's a good question. That style, I think, has kind of worn on me from going through a master's and a doctorate. She studied so much of it. That's a good question. I don't choose to listen to much of it now because I listened to so much of it when I was younger. And I'm always exploring what my colleagues are doing now, which there's so much music making going on that I'm constantly checking out what's just come out or what's just been premiered. So there's there's not much time in my day between my writing and listening to that and the moments of silence that I need to get my head to calm down.
Wow. Yeah.
Weird. I mean, it's really, people say, oh, what kind of music you listen to? I'm like, well, sometimes in the end of a day, I am like 6 hours of writing music. I need silence on the other end, or something not related to classical that's nowhere close to what I'm doing. If I need to stop the music in my own head, because my own music tortures me.
Oh no, really?
Yeah, it does. It just plays constantly. It can be pretty nightmarish.
That's amazing. Well, I know I don't really listen to my own performances for fun. I do. It's very instructive, and I do get to the point where I can enjoy them. But I can't imagine what it's like for you as a composer with that.
It doesn't leave your head, especially if you're going through a premiere, because you're living in the rehearsals and analyzing constantly. So it stays on a loop basically for like a week.
Wow. Well, YouTube to the rescue with a little bit of George Pearl starting now, and then we will chat. And we'll stop there with just the beginning of the George Pearl Sonata a Quattro with Dolce Suono Ensemble. Jennifer, what do you think?
I kind of, it's kind of cool. I like the way that the all the instruments move together. There's something about that that's kind of nice. So it's almost like a homophonic, although they don't usually conceive of it that way. But it makes me listen to the textures differently because the instruments are moving together. I have such a composer nerdy brain. It's like, I'm like, so the combination of sound of, the winds together with the strings. But I also was sitting there thinking, oh, this is an interesting concept, the sonata for four. Mm-hmm. We never think of sonatas that way. And sometimes as a composer, you think, all right, how can I vary the way I'm thinking about a form that's a traditional form, like a symphony or a sonata, or, you know what I mean? Like, what can I do different in a concerto that's different from like Mozart and Beethoven and even Stravinsky's violin concerto? How do you vary what you're doing? So I'm constantly like questioning and listening to what other composers do with their textures, their lines, how they get the stuff to unfold. And some music you can't really get a sense of until you've listened to the whole thing, the entire architecture of the way it unfolds. So
yeah, no, I mean, I don't play that style that often and loved it. That was my first Pearl, and it's very thorny and kind of dissonantly complex. Mm-hmm. And like what you're saying, Sonata a Quattro, to my nerdy brain, I literally was thinking about Baroque trio sonatas, but with a totally different language. Because I guess he was mostly in atonality, but deriving a kind of tonality from his system of how he integrated the serial system of Schoenberg.
He sounds more tonal when he integrates his serial technique, which it's a little different for every composer. I mean, it's a thing I always admire about Berg's violin concerto, that there's a tonal element in it, but apparently Berg was always apologizing to his teacher Schoenberg for, there's a little melody here, But Berg sometimes would make a rose so that it was kind of, it implied tonality. Yes. every composer does this differently or to a different degree. And I've actually used atonality in pieces. My flute piece, Rapid Fire, there's nothing tonal about it, but it depends on other elements, extended techniques and rhythm to kind of make it cohere. But I'm speaking like the geeky, nerdy composer that I am.
I love that. And I'm so glad you mentioned the Berg Violin Concerto. I think the first time I heard it, and definitely the first time I really got to know it, was in your 20th Century Music.
Oh, that's great.
But absolutely. I mean, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Ken shared a piece. We were talking about this generation of composers, Milhaud's Concerto for Percussion and Small Orchestra. Suggesting mid-1920s. Yeah, well, that's a whole other topic, which is fascinating, of European emigre composers who came here during World War II. So next time we could talk about that. But Jennifer, I mean, before we wrap, I want to thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you. So exciting to hear your music and your thoughts on your music and music in general, and anything else you want to share or current projects.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I just finished this is an interesting project that's coming up and will be at the New York Phil and a couple other places. There are 5 composers writing single movements for a larger violin concerto for Josh Bell. Wow. And it's me, Edgar Meyer, Jesse Montgomery, Jake Heggie, who's an opera composer, and Kevin Putz. We're each doing a movement, and I just turned mine in. I think that premieres at the New York Phil on the September 28th. And I don't know what this is going to be like. I'm like, wow, a concerto with 5 movements, 5 different composers, and it could be really long, but it might be really interesting. So, but in answer, Bryce asked the question, we are selling the flute concerto now. Yes, Bryce, and I definitely will sign it for you. So, hopefully somebody will record it. We're working on this now. I don't have an archival recording as the National Flute Convention does not record their orchestra concerts. So, but Bryce was there. He heard it. It's a very energetic piece, definitely. So, but thank you. I think for everyone who attended too, it's nice seeing familiar names and even names I don't know, but I will bump into these people down the road at a concert, which is totally cool. So,
absolutely. It's always great to see everybody, and the music world is small in exciting ways. And I can't wait to see you again in person. And we're going to be on different albums celebrating the 250th anniversary of the President's Own Marine Band. Newark. So very excited about that, Jennifer. But once again, thanks for taking a little time out of the busy composing schedule you have. It's very special to see your studio where a lot of it happens too.
It's amazing a cat didn't make an appearance. I'm kind of marveling. They must be sleeping somewhere. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. But okay, well, thanks again. Can't wait to see you. Thanks for coming on Tea with Mimi. And looking forward for more episodes. Everybody just follow the pages or send an email to me through my website or Dolce Sono Ensemble, and we will get you on to receive the newsletter with news about upcoming concerts and other shows. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Jennifer, see you soon. Thanks again.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Bye.